Today is September the 12th, 2021, and we are at the home of Mary Jensen.
Okay, you grew up in Cowley.
I did.
Tell us about growing up in Cowley.
I was born in 31. I was the next to the last children of Bertha and Rudd Lewis. And my brother Paul was about 3 years younger, and my sister Shirley was about 3 years older. Mother lost some children in between Esther and Shirley. So Esther and Dee were about 10 years older than I. But anyway, I went to school. We didn't have kindergarten, but we had Rita Rasmussen as our first grade teacher, and Ruth Tippett was our second grade teacher, and Irene Safford was our third grade teacher, and our fourth grade teacher was a Partridge, and then she married, and I can't remember who, and then Rita Rasmussen was our fifth grade teacher, and our sixth grade teacher was Opal Horston. And then soon after that, we moved to the high school. I think you've heard stories about the Old Rock School. By the time we moved into the old academy building, which is now the offices, the floor on the second floor had sunk about like that, and so the building was condemned. But it had those broad, the stairway was at least that wide, and when we had assemblies, the upper grades always sat on the stairs, and the lower grades sat downstairs on little chairs they pulled out from the classroom. And there was always the fire escape, and nobody was supposed to go on that fire escape, but Karma Allred Partridge, she was probably a saint. She probably never did that, but we'd always climb the fire escape and go down, even though it was condemned too.
Now, is that the whirly one?
It was, yeah, it was kind of curved.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and the playground was just rock. There was a whirly and some swings. I was just remembering a joke that my son told us, and I don't think it's in, I don't want you to put that on there. And we started to use the gym for our gyms. And of course, I remember the basketball games and the football games. I remember Scott Welch was on crutches. He could move on those crutches as fast as I could run.
Oh my gosh.
He was quite an athlete. John Welch was 2 years younger than I, and Eileen was 3 years older than I, and then Alice was older than that, and Scott was older than that, but they were my next door neighbors, and they're also my cousins. The Meekses, when my mother, Esther Meeks Mortensen, came here, they also brought my Uncle Joe, my Uncle John, my Uncle Lou, and Aunt Alice Tebbs. And they all lived on the same street. So there was Joe and John and Lou and Esther and Alice right on that street where we lived. And we would play at night. I remember the Harvey kids especially, they'd come up and play, and the Tebbses and the Snells. We'd play all kinds of games at night. And that was so fun. We weren't afraid of anything because nobody came. There were three hotels in Cowley. The Mortensen Hotel, where Lynn lives, the Safford Hotel, where Debbie Wombeck lives, and the Lewis Hotel. And the Lewis Hotel burned down at Christmas time when I was a year old. So that was 32. Grandpa Lewis, Dave, lived alone because his two wives had both died. And he was trying to put out this fire by running back and forth to the water pump and throwing water on the fire, but their insulation was just sawdust and newspaper, and it just destroyed every memo of the Lewises that was around. So that was a loss. I remember the Tebbses, especially Reba, and all of her kids that sang. And then Hattie and Marion and Sydney and Tom and Helen and Sister Tebbs. Hattie was my home ec teacher. And they were my cousins too, because they were related to Aunt Alice. And Alice had rheumatoid arthritis, and her daughter Vivian and my sister Esther did a lot of caring for her. And she was in so much pain, and there wasn't anything she could take, that she would allow them to move her. She sat in a chair right by the window that would face east, and she would sit there all day. Uncle Jim was very kind to her, and he got a washer for her, and so they always had a hard girl. But Esther and Vivian would move her. They would pick her up. She was small anyway, and move her from the chair to the bed. Uncle Jim, of course, had lost a leg, and he was always swearing because the leg hurt, the prosthesis never fit, and he limped badly. But he ran those farms, Jim and Jess, and their farm was outside of town. My dad had the gift of healing. Hattie and Uncle Jim, or Jim, Hattie's husband, Jess, their little boy had drowned in the canal. And Hattie knew that Dad, Rudd Lewis, had the gift of healing. And he was dead, but they got a hold of Dad and they wanted him to give him a blessing. And Dad said, he put his hand on his head and he said, "Hattie, I'm sorry, but there's no blessing." And then there was a Wilson that had died with a gunshot wound. And they asked for Dad to come give him a blessing, and he knelt on the way over there. And the Lord told him there was no blessing for the child. Dad was losing his eyesight. I'm telling you about my family, so I'm not telling you much.
That's great.
That's what we want.
That's what we
History.
want.
My dad had one eye because he told me that his mother didn't like him, and she had pushed a broom handle into his face and it hit his eye, so he had one eye. And then he was gradually losing his eyesight, and he was married to Grace, and he was losing his eyesight, so he was still driving because Grace couldn't drive, and she would watch the road and he would steer according to her explanations, but he was going blind, and he started to bleed from a bleeding ulcer, worried about losing his eye, and he died in the Lovell hospital. He bled to death. And I was so distressed.
How old were you? How old were you when that happened?
I was married,
Okay.
I don't know,
But you weren't a child at home. You were.
no,
Yeah. Okay.
no. There were 3 bedrooms in the house. So Mother and Dad's room, and then there was a room to the north and one to the south. And when I was 10, of course, Dee took one bedroom, and Esther took another, and the bathroom was in between. And this is Esther's story. Dee always had these buddies with him: Albert Benson, his cousin, and Ted Wilson, his other buddy. So Esther was in the bathtub, and Dee's room was through there. He said, "Esther, I want to come into my bedroom." She said, "Okay, I'll just kind of cover up here, and you walk through." Well, he walked through with his 2 buddies. She was so mad at him. Let's see, one of the Horston boys and one of the Jorgensen boys, Dad slept on the north side of the bed, and they threw water through the window onto my dad. And Dad said, "Well, I'm going to though everybody talks, and I'm going to find out who did that, and I'm going to get them." But it was, I can't remember the name of the Horston. Was it Wilcox? I can't remember. Ken Banks was a year younger than I. Always had that limp. We had 6 boys in our class, and they're all gone. Howard Hollyoak, Bob Welsh, Jim Benson, my cousin, Dennis Godfrey, Dean Smith, and Don Harvey. Don and Dean were both a year older than we were. They'd been kept out of school for one reason or other, and they're all gone, but I have close memories of all of them. The Hollyoak family were just scratching to make ends meet, and they lived out of town, but somehow or other, he and Howard and his family rigged up something with a motor and some sort of a steering wheel and a gas pedal, and he made that into some sort of a conveyance, and he'd drive it to school. Jim lived on the south side of the railroad track, and Dennis lived on the north side of the track, and they were trappers, both of them. And so sometimes they'd have a skunk smell on them. but Bob Welch always had a car, and it was the common thing for them to have a gun in the back of their car. Always a gun. And I think Porter Dalton had a motorcycle. But I didn't like motorcycles, still don't. But I think he had a motorcycle. When we were at tournament that year, his brother shot himself. I can't remember which one it was, but the brother was small. Porter was short, but this brother had been a jockey, and he probably became an alcoholic, and he became very depressed. And he killed himself in the house and shot through his head, and it scattered all over that house. And so reporter came home from the tournament in that mess. Such a terrible thing. Bob Welch's mother, Drew, and Karma Smith's mother, they both had died that year when we were in first grade. And I remember sitting in the parlor in Grandma Mortensen's parlor during that time, and she'd invited the Welch kids over, and I remember sitting there in Grandma's house with Bob sitting close to me, or sitting in the room. In the Mortensen Hotel, if you climb up the stairs, she had a window set on point that was halfway up the stairs, and I thought it was beautiful. Grandma had one of the few telephones in town. It wasn't until after the war that I think we got a telephone, and I think it was 548. I think that was what it was. And it was a party line, and Mother loved the party line.
Who didn't then?
She'd just pick up the phone and listen to whoever was on. And I'd tell her, Mother, you're not supposed to do that. But Mother learned to drive when she was past 40. And even though we tried to tell her how you use second gear, she'd put it in low, and then she'd immediately shift into third. And so it'd go, and then we'd shift it into third. Aunt Abigail Nielsen, that lived, well, Shirley's house was here, and Aunt Abigail lived right over here. She wasn't our aunt, but we always called her Aunt Abigail. And so Mother had a route in those little cars that she had to pick them up if she was going anywhere. So she had to pick up Aunt Abigail, and she had to pick up Aunt Hilda. Anyway, it was a foursome. I don't remember who was the foursome. But if she went to Lovell, she had to take the other two with her. And Mother was heavy, and she couldn't walk very well, and Mother were always concerned about the size of their feet. She probably had feet like mine, and I wear a nine and a half, and she was trying to cram those feet into a smaller shoe, and she had horrible corns and stuff. So it was not easy for her to walk, but they took pride in small feet. Well, I'm just grateful I have a shoe long enough to fit my feet. Dad, of course, we had this movie house, or the show house. It was always show house, and the Bischoff ran that. So on Thursday night, there was a double feature of 2 cowboy shows. And then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I think they showed other movies. And we never had any money, but we'd often sneak in. And I think High Bischoff he knew that. But we never had any money, so we did stuff. We always had a big garden. When Shirley married Dick hadn't been reared on a garden. So Dick was hanging around, and he asked Dick and I to go to the garden. We were gardening up below the canal up there, and Dick hoed up a whole row of something or other because he didn't know plants. That was the last time Dad asked him to hoe.
He did it on purpose. Maybe.
We used to walk the canal and pick asparagus. And Mother believed if a vegetable was cooked, it ought to be cooked well. And I hated asparagus because it was always soggy. But we have asparagus out here, and we've learned to love asparagus and cook it. We'll miss the asparagus this year. Mother loved cream, and of course they always had a cow. She had her own butter press, and she would sell it at the store or barter it at the store with that mark that said, "This is Bertha's butter." There was always chickens, so we always had eggs. I always had a cow. There was always cream, and Mother loved to cream everything. I soon learned that wasn't the thing I was supposed to eat. Aunt Ann Meeks, whose maiden name was Chittister, and Sylvia's been trying to figure out how the Chittisters got to Cowley. Well, she was Aunt Ann Meeks' mother, and she's buried at the Cowley Cemetery. But anyway, Aunt Alice, Aunt Ann would call across the street to Mother, and she said, "I have the starter for salt rising bread ready. Send one of the kids over." So we'd go over and get the salt rising starter, and Mother would bake the bread, and then we'd take loaves of it to Aunt Ann. Dee and Albert teased Uncle Lou, and call him Lou Weeks, or anyway, they made a joke out of it. It made him mad. The Mortensen Hotel had a porch on it. Do they still have a porch? Grandpa was a big man. He was 6'4" or 6'6". He was a huge big man, and a strong man. Well, a car had stalled, and Grandpa went out to the road and picked up the back end of the car and probably ruptured a disc, because from then on he was sitting on the porch because he was in such pain. So Grandma ran the hotel. During this time, the WPA came in to build the log house, the log gym, and one of the WPA workers' name was Steve McGregor, and they logged during the summer. And Albert Benson, see, Laura was my mother's sister, Laura Benson, Laura Mortensen Benson. And Albert and Steve McGregor had been working in the mountains cutting woods for the log gym, and they had both frostbitten their feet. And so they were staying at Grandma's hotel. And Grandma couldn't stand for them just to be sitting. So she taught them to quilt or crochet, but I think it was quilt, but they had to be busy. I would ask Mother, "Well, where's your bedroom?" She said, "I didn't have a bedroom. I slept in any room that was empty." So upstairs, there's a big room that faced south, and then there was a little tiny room that faced east, and a big room that faced west, and then there were two bedrooms north. And not until Esther and Keith occupied the upstairs and Jenny and Dean occupied the lower stairs, there was no bathroom. And Shorty, Shorty, lived there in that little room. he worked at the canning factory. One time, he asked Mother to shorten his pants, and he always had a short leg. And Mother cut the fabric on the wrong leg. I remember so instead of cutting the right leg, she cut the wrong one. And Mother always fixed a lunch for him. And when he'd come from work, we always look in his lunch to see if there's anything in there we might eat. Mother had a great big aluminum pan that she made bread in. She never had a recipe. She didn't make a lot of different things. It was sort of the same all the time, but it was always good. Made pies and cakes and bread, always bread. The first stove I remember was there was a level where there were the burners, and then the oven was up here. So it was probably a wood stove or a coal stove. Karma Smith, Russ Smith's daughter, and that place where Mark Gams used to live, that was the Smith house. And we were in primary with Karma Smith. In our class, there was Karma Smith and Karma Partridge, and Fern Snell, and Laura Matthews, and Alice Baird Brownell, and those boys that I mentioned, and Lila Graham, and Alice Lou Dalton Tanner, and me. We had a great time together. We just had a great time together. In fourth grade, a Hispanic boy, Manuel, came to fourth grade, and his family, of course, were migrant workers. And we were in fourth grade, and he was tall, he was big because he was older than we, but he was always chosen first on any ball game, any game that we played, because he was big and stronger than we. And of course, he didn't read very well, or if he read at all, but he was in class. And we worked really hard on penmanship. Sister Partridge, or Teacher Partridge, we carefully wrote well. I'm left-handed, and my dad, when I went to school, he was the superintendent, he told the teachers, don't you touch Mary's hand. You let her write like she wants to write. Well, Fern Snell, nobody told them not to change Fern's handwriting. So Fern wrote like this. And of course that smears everything. And we always had music. There used to be a bell in the top of that old building, and there was a room that the boys liked to get into the school and ring that bell on Halloween, or move the bell. I think one year they put a cow up there. I don't know how they did that.
I've read that story.
I think my dad was involved.
Don Parkin, who was the sheriff of Bighorn County, his wife was kind of heavy, and she was wearing a red dress, and the kids looked out the window and said, Uncle Don Parkin has a new tractor. So they all left school and went down to see, but it wasn't a new tractor. It was the Don Parkin's wife. I don't remember her name. But the Parkins are related through the Lewis line, and so were the Gwynns. Aunt Annie and Uncle Ed, they lived, here's the viaduct, and they had a farm right there. And Aunt Annie is my dad's first cousin. She was a Lewis. Ann bared, her mother said, "Yeah, Ann's got that Lewis blood in her. That makes her ornery." Anyway, there were no sidewalks, and the road wasn't paved. Well, I think there was a sidewalk on that north side because Mother, although she didn't walk well, occasionally she would walk to the show with Dad. But she didn't walk very far, but she did go occasionally with Dad. She never went to church. I don't remember Mother ever going to church. She went to Relief Society, and she invited people into the house to quilt. I remember many times I was under the quilt listening to the ladies as they visited and quilted. And Mother always had handiwork. She embroidered. She tried to knit, but the knitting somehow went this way. So that wasn't her favorite thing, but she loved to crochet and loved to embroider. And she loved, if she hemmed anything, it wasn't going to come out. It was very sharp, very clean stitches. We had a sewing machine. It was a treadle. And Shirley was sewing along, and she broke a needle into one of her hands, and they couldn't get it out. It was just a little piece of the needle. And years later, something kind of erupted on one of her hands, and they opened it, and there was that piece of needle sticking out. There are things I loved. I loved to roller skate, I loved to ice skate, and I loved to swim. And all you have to have for me was a swimming suit, a pair of roller skates, and they were crampons, and a pair of ice skates. One year I broke a leg. I broke a leg because we had a tire swing hanging from a limb in the backyard, and the limb broke, and I fell and broke this leg, and so I was in a cast. And Mother somehow or other got a pair of crutches, and they were too small or too big for me. But I knew that people were in the canal swimming, and so with a broken leg and those ill-fitting crutches, I'd hobble up to the canal to watch them swim. And it was the pump house, the Cowley pump house, and there was a diving board, and I loved to dive into that deeper part of the canal. I thought I was a great swimmer, but what I was doing was swimming downstream. But I wasn't afraid of the water. The Smith family, that's where Jim McDermott's wife, Clara Smith and Dean Smith and Melvin Smith, and that family lived outside of town, and they had a pond, and you could skate on it. But you could also skate on the canal, and you could also skate on I guess it was some sort of a pond. I don't know if it was the sewer pond or what it was. But we were playing crack the whip. I was in 6th grade, and I was the end of the whip, and they whipped me around, and I fell off, and I cracked my pelvis. And so for the Christmas break, I was sitting with my leg under me because my hip was cracked. And when I had an x-ray before Clark was born, he said, "Oh, you cracked your pelvis." And I said, "Oh, yep, I know exactly when that happened." But I went into 6th grade still sitting on my leg. But of course, she never went to the doctor. I did dislocate my shoulder doing something and I couldn't, or something, I did go to have that leg cast. I did go to get a tooth pulled because it was an abscessed tooth. I did go when I did something with my shoulder, but we didn't go to the hospital. But I've had one migraine in my life, and I remember sitting on the porch, and Melvin, the bricklayers from Otto, Burlington.
The Wardells?
Yes, the Wardells came, and I was in the midst of this migraine headache. And I remember sitting there on the porch railing, because I loved those boys. But finally, it lasted so long, they finally took me to the hospital with that migraine. Never had one since. Went to the University of Wyoming, graduated with a degree in home ec, and I taught school. I taught 5th grade in Cowley, and I taught home ec in Powell. But between the first and second year of teaching in Powell, we got married. And I became pregnant in March, and then we moved from there to the University of Wyoming, where Wally got his degree. And so Clark was born in Laramie, and Lorraine was born in Laramie. Wally got a contract to teach in Evanston. So Beth and Glenn were born in Evanston. Then we came back here, and Kurt and Karen were born in Powell. Dr. Kattenhorn was my doctor for a while, and Dr. Deese was later. Karen got leukemia when she was 3, and Dr. Deese was the doctor. And every month she had to have a shot. Every 3rd month we went to Denver. Sometimes I took a bus. Sometimes we drove. When they diagnosed Karen, I went down. I flew down with her, and they put me in put her in the Children's Hospital there in Denver, and the Ronald McDonald House was a couple of blocks away, and she was there. They put her in remission, and pretty soon we were home again. I was very careful, though, that I wouldn't let anybody in the house. And I thought she was going to lose her hair, so I bought her a wig, and she never lost her hair, so that wig was around. But somewhere in the middle of her treatment, something went awry. It was always on a Saturday. I called the hospital, and what was his name? He was our oncologist, and he said, "You've got to bring her right now." So we went down, and her hematocrit it's supposed to be a 16 or 17 or 18, I think, and hers was about 6. So they started to stop that infection. And they gave her transfusions, and one of the transfusions was a white blood cell transfusion. And so to do that was a very complicated thing. And so there was a man and a woman, both of them were nurses because it was such a fragile kind of a transfusion. And I was over in the corner watching and praying. And they said afterwards, we'd never done a transfusion like that without some sort of problem, but this one was smooth. Vernon Sessions, who used to live right over here on the corner, he was there practicing law in Denver, and he was very kind to us. Dina Ames, who grew up in Cowley but had moved to Denver, and she was very kind to us also, to me and to Wally. But when we went that second time or third time, and Karen's hematocrit was so low, we didn't know if she was going to live or die. And she hadn't eaten. And Dad came in, and Dad was eating something. And she kind of roused herself, and I want to eat that. So that was their turning point. And she started to get well. She had a couple of byproducts from these chemos. One of them was she had a kind of a rash on her body, and another one was that her eyesight made her kind of short-sighted. Dr. Whatever his name was, he finally decided that the treatments were more dangerous than the cancer. She had acute lymphatic leukemia, the easiest to cure. In the hospital at that time, there were 2 children with cancer who came in. One was a beautiful, beautiful young Hispanic girl. Another one was a teenage boy, and neither of them survived, but Karen survived. She was 3, and for 2 years, I think, we returned to Denver every 3 months, but she never came out of remission. But we kept going every 3 months. He would inject this stuff into her back with his great big needle, and then she'd sit up and she'd say, "Let's go home." And Dr. Deese gave those shots to her in between the 3 months when we'd go down to Denver. I usually went alone, but finally I just told Dad, I can't do this anymore alone. You've got to come with me. And so he did. And finally he told us that we didn't need to come anymore. But for years, I don't know if they still do, but for years they were keeping track of Karen, see how she was. So she's 45, I think, now, and never been out of remission. I was afraid they were going to make her unable to have children, but she has 3. She married kind of late, and so she has 3, and grateful. She's worked all the time, all of her life. She worked for Solo Cup. Solo Cup developed a Solo Cup red Solo Cup, and that was Karen's invention, and she was working in Seattle, and they moved her from Seattle into corporate office in Chicago, and she lived in Chicago sometime, and they had a mutual friend, and he decided that Cortina was supposed to be Karen's love affair, and so he was out there too, and they were engaged and got married out there. Where did they marry? Somewhere out west, somewhere in one of these temples out here. They bought a house to remodel, and Cortina was a perfectionist, and so when they moved her when she stopped working with the Solo Cup and moved, Chicago to Seattle to work. The house was unfinished, and so Karen moved to, where was it? Boise, somewhere in Idaho. Anyway, she moved there for work with an 8-month-old baby. So she informed us that we had to come and help her with that transformation. And so we went out. Oh, she was in Seattle. So we went out, and there was this 9-month-old baby crawling around. And Dad's a good baby tender, so we stayed there for 2 weeks, until Karen could arrange for a babysitter and whatnot. And she worked there. And we left her, and I just didn't know how she was going to do it. I didn't know how she was going to work and take care of that baby. And Cortina was still finishing the house. And that went on for quite a while. Karen was in a doctor's office one time, and at the moment she was unemployed, but she graduated in marketing from BYU, and she was sitting there in this wellness clinic for children, and a woman said, "We're looking for a marketer," and Karen said, I'm a marketer." And she started to work for Franklin Sensor. They make a stud finder. It's about this big, and it's an electronic thing. And so it tells the depth, the width, and everything about that stud, not just the nail, but the whole business. And she still works there. At first they had just 3 employees for the management, and they had some temporary workers. Now they have 4 or 5 in the office, and they have many online. I mean, they put the thing together. And she is the marketer. She's flown all over the United States getting contracts, so she's a very valuable employee. Cortino has been an entrepreneur, doing things, selling securities and stuff. I don't know exactly what he does, but he works, and she continues to work. Her oldest is 9, then her Cruz is 9, Selvoy is 7, and her little girl will be 4 in December. And so Karen still works, and her children have been reared by a baby tender, but Karen works really hard to do that. Cortino's mother has rheumatoid arthritis, and she couldn't manage the little house she had in Provo, and so she lives with them and helps with the children a little bit. But they have busy lives back there in Meridian, Idaho. Clark is an optometrist who works with his son Seth. Both of them are optometrists living in Jensen Eye Care in Casper. Seth's wife, Sierra, died of cancer just this spring, cancer of the colon that spread all over, so she left 2 children. And Seth's alone, and Lorene tends those children. They do school online, which I don't believe in, but that's not my choice. And then the next child is Beth, and she and her husband live in Washington. That's a sister city to St. George. and he has just retired as the Parks and Recreation Manager in St. George. And they were here for a week helping me get packed and settled and organized. They were wonderful. And the next one is Glenn. Glenn has bipolar disease, and finally he's managed it. He and his wife divorced and left 4 children, and divorce doesn't work very well. The children suffered from that, still suffer from that divorce. They've had divergent lives, but they're still good children. But it's painful. Now he's married again to Cynthia, and it just seems like it's a wonderful, wonderful marriage. Kurt and Heidi live in Spanish Fork, and they have 5. And they married their oldest son, Dale, this spring. And then Julia was married the last day of July, and we went down. And that's one of the miracles. They were having an outdoor in their backyard reception, and it had been raining all day. At 6 o'clock, the reception started at 7. At 6 o'clock, the rain stopped. They ran out with their whole family. All of our family was there. All of our married kids were there. And lots of the grandkids were there. Rushed out and wiped off the tables and chairs, threw their tablecloth on on the tablecloth, and the caterer came. He said, I can't do this cooking in the rain, but it stopped at 6 o'clock. The reception was wonderful. The night was balmy. It was just wonderful. And they stood in line for almost 2 hours. At 5 minutes to 9, it started to rain again. So then they had to hustle in and bring the gifts in and help the caterer get in and put things away. But that was one of our little miracles.
I'd say.
When Lorraine was in 4th grade and Beth was in 3rd grade, they both got rheumatic fever. And I was carrying Beth out of John Welch's office and broke this leg. And it was broken in many places. It involved my ankle. And that's why I limp. And that's been, I don't know, Beth is 61, and it happened when she was 7, almost 8. So I've had this leg to contend with all those many years. But I'm still walking, so they kept that cast off and they never moved it, so I have a stiff ankle. So I loved school. And then we had Donetta Willis, and that changed everybody's lives. I remember listening to D. Ray Peterson give a talk when he was in the state presidency, and he was reciting some of the poetry that I remembered from Donetta. I remember her standing. She never sat down all the time she was teaching. She was always on her feet, always wore a suit, a skirt, a blouse, and a jacket, always. Upstairs in that old school. Every year we had a play. In the junior class, you always had a play, and that was a costume play. We did Cinderella, and then in the senior year, you have another play directed by Donetta, and it was always done in the church. But this wasn't a costume play, it was just a dress play. I mean, just ordinary dress. But Jean Partridge was Cinderella, and Jim Benson was the prince, and she didn't want him to kiss her. And Bob Welch was the king, and I was the queen. And that was really fun. And there was supposed to be 10 angels or something that worked with us, and we had that many girls in the class. So that was wonderful. Loved school. Most of the boys in the class went into the service. Porter and Howard and Don. Must have been the Korean War. Anyway, they were in the service. But Bob wasn't in the service. He went on to, he must have gone to the University of Texas because he worked down there. And his boy was going to BYU, and he was a climber, and he slipped and fell, and it killed him, and I think that changed his life. I know they just finally, Arlene, Bob's widow, finally sold the Welch farm. Bob's been gone for many years. Of course, there wasn't a highway, so between the Wilcox house, I don't know if you looked or not, but the Wilcox house, the church house, and the one on the street where Main Street is, and the Crosby house are all rock, but they're all different colored rocks, if you've noticed that. And the school is another colored rock. I think it's just marvelous to see those different colors of rock. Shirley was my closest sister, and I still miss my sister Shirley. We were great friends. She was a wonderful, gentle woman. Always loved Shirley. Nestor and Dee, of course, were 10 years older, but I love them too. And the stories that Dee told. I went over, Dee was quite infirm, and he wanted us to come over and help weed his little garden. So I was over there hoeing and pulling weeds and stuff. And he said, "Mary, you never stop talking." I said, "I know. I don't want to die and not have used up all my words." Shirley and I were invited to be on one of his carriage rides in the Cowley parade. We were all dressed up. We had long dresses and fancy hats. And that was the day the horses decided to act up and started to buck and kick, so we got off, never were in the parade. I remember the Cowley parade, Peggy Rasmussen and Emily Welch Tebbs, they were on a parade and they were singing Purple, the bikini song.
Itsy bitsy teeny weeny.
Yes. Itsy bitsy teeny weeny polka dot bikini.
That was the music. They were doing that. We've always loved the Cowley parade. Wally had been teaching in Evanston. We were there for 3 years, and I taught school. Wally taught math, and I taught 5th grade for half a year. I taught half a day of school because I had kids that were home. And so then we got this contract in Byron, and we decided we'd move home. So we moved into the schoolhouse that was right across from the post office. That used to be in the big house, the BIG group. It was owned by them. And we moved there, and the school allowed us to make a bedroom downstairs for the girls. So there was a room downstairs for the boys and room for the girls. We used the other bedroom as a dining room because the kitchen was like an alley, not at all adequate, but it worked. And And the baby was in the dining room. That was Glenn. And then we built this house when Clark, I think, was a senior in high school. So Clark served a mission in Sweden. Glenn served a mission in Chile. Kurt served a foreign mission in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He told me it was a foreign mission because it was among the black people, poor black people.
Mm-hmm.
And Karen served a mission in Uruguay. And our grandsons have all served missions. I've loved to sew. I've loved to quilt. I learned to play the piano somewhat. Ora Welch taught me. So did Sister Longfellow, and so did, she was married to a lawyer, and I can't remember her name, but I took piano lessons. I can play a hymn. That's about what I can do. I'm not very good. But all of our girls play. And Glenn loves to sit down and record and make music, but the other two, they insisted they take piano. And Clark could play if he'd decide to, but he doesn't play. So we have 6 wonderful children and their families. We have 31 grandchildren and 40-something or other, 44 or something great-grandchildren. We have 2 new babies this summer, and we have another one on the way, which we're proud of. A life in Cowley was wonderful because we were so free. I walked to school. Mother never drove us to school. We walked, summer, winter. We wore those long brown stockings with a garter belt. And the women always wore dresses, always. But I had good teachers. Learned to read and write. Went to the University of Wyoming. Had a Sears and Roebuck scholarship, and I had another scholarship, and somehow or other I managed to get through school. I always worked. I worked at the cafeteria there for most of my livelihood. In my senior year, Dad was tired of helping me, and so I borrowed money to finish school. And then I taught school in Powell for 2 years. And then we went to Laramie. Had a happy life. Always been a hard worker in a sweet, gentle manner. Grandpa Jenny helped us frame the house. After it was framed, he said, "It's up to you now." My friend said, now that it was put together, she said, "You know, as soon as you build a house, you'll start to have a problem here and there." And she's true. We're always having to fix things like the water heater or the bathtub or the faucet or something.
Mm-hmm.
This is Shirley's coffee table that she gave away. I've always sung. I don't know that I have a voice anymore, but since COVID we haven't had a choir. But I've always sung. We used to sing with the Bighorn or the state choir, and Croft, I can see her, but I can't remember her name, and Brother Two were the choir leaders, and we always had that big concert.
Was it Louise?
What?
Was it Louise? No.
No. Much older than that, a
Oh.
generation older. Louise was the choir director for a while, I think.
Was it her mother, Ora?
No.
Oh.
No. I can see her, but I can't think of her name.
Kathleen?
What?
Kathleen?
No. No. But anyway, a generation older than that. But I started to sing in a choir at 12. And last year before COVID, I was still in the choir. Janelle Brown and Hazel and I used to be the trio. I was the second. Hazel was the alto and Janelle was the soprano. And we sang a lot. Janelle lived here for a while. I loved Janelle before she decided she was a polygamist.
Did you sing with Ines now
I did.
when she lived here?
Yes, she and Golden lived up the street before they moved to Idaho he taught at BYUI, taught Spanish. He served on a Mexican mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I think I've bled you dry.
You've run out? Are you done?
There was the Welch store, and there was the Tippett store. Was it the Tippett store? I think so. When Mother died, Dad went to that store, the one that was right next to the drugstore, and he said, I don't want you to come to Bert's funeral because you're a Republican, and I only want Democrats to come. That was before he became a Republican.
I see.
Dad used to pound the pulpit. He taught Sunday school until the week before he died. He died of a bleeding ulcer because he was going blind. But he taught the 7th grade, the 16 and 17 years old. Sylvia Gams was in his class. Good teacher. The generation that knew my dad and taught by him, they always reminded me how they loved Dad. There was a Hispanic family here. I think their name was Mays. And this girl was in high school, and she always wore a white blouse to school and a dark skirt every day for school. Always freshly washed and ironed. And one of the pep squad girls came in and said, we don't want her in the pep squad anymore. She always just wears that same skirt and blouse. And Dad got really mad at him. He said, I don't care who's in that pep squad. She's going to be in there, and you may not be there, but she is going to be there. Mm. So we were taught really early about being considerate of people. Dad employed some of the German prisoners to work on the farm, and Paul tells quite a story about going with Dad up to get the prisoners in Deaver. I guess you know that there was a number of camps, mm-hmm. And I saw that lecture about all those camps, and that was really interesting. But Paul would sit next to Dad driving the truck with those load of prisoners in his back, and they never tried to get away because they didn't know where they could go, and they thought they were better fed here than they were in Germany. But Paul was always afraid. One day, Dad said to the guard, well, would you like to come to the house and have a home-cooked meal? He said, sure. And so he handed the gun to one of the prisoners and said, here, you guard the men, I'll be back.
Wow.
But Mother sometimes fed him on the lawn there in front of the house. But I don't think there was any Germans who tried to escape because they didn't really know where they were and they didn't know where they'd go. Mm. We swam in the canal. skated in the canal.
Was anybody baptized in the canal?
I was baptized in the reservoir. And Jackie Tebbs was baptized the same summer day. My birthday's in October, but Jackie and I were baptized in June, I think. And Jim Tebbs said, "Oh, Jackie, show them how they can swim. As soon as they baptize you, start to swim." She didn't, but then I was confirmed by one of the partridges. I don't know why Dad didn't do it, but he didn't. Married Wally when I was 23, and then we started our family. Six wonderful children that have kept their covenants. That's the most telling thing I can say about my children. They've kept their covenants.
Mm-hmm. They were taught well.
Yeah, the Jensen family has a long history of faith, and so our kids were right here in the midst of this culture with the Jensens, Uncle Ernie and Aunt Evelyn and Grandpa and Grandma and Dick and Myrna next door. And now we have many non-members here, many, and I don't know them. Except I have a next door neighbor that I love. He was reared as a Catholic, but he never goes to church, and I don't know that he knows much about his church. But he went to Catholic school. But he's a wonderful, wonderful, compassionate neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cowley now has the very first church, besides the Mormon church, being built in Cowley.
That's what I've read in the newspaper.
In the last 100 years. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
We don't have another church, but I know there's Catholics that go to Lovell. And some people go to that church that used to be the IGA store.
Oh, yeah, the Bible church.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was a member of the school board for a while. I was mayor of Byron for 4 years, I think. I used to be very active in the Republican Party. I was part of the Central Committee down in Basin, Grable. I had many friends in the party. Wally and I went down to a GOP convention, and we were invited to some sort of a church, a meeting of the senators and representatives about faith. And this Catholic lady had organized it, so we went to the Catholic church, and I looked in the phone book to try to find the Catholic church, and I found one or two Catholic churches or just one. And then I looked also about the LDS church, about our church, and I could find 4 or 5 bishops there that didn't used to be there. So that changes the nature of Rock Springs.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
I used to have a boyfriend that worked in the mines. I heard something about, it was one of the conference talks about them going into this cave, and I thought, how scary is that? Anything that dark is scary, scary. I don't like enclosed places.
No.
Bishop Horston was one of my bishops. One of the Petersons was one of my bishops.
That was probably Randy, right?
No, it's probably Robert Rand,
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Oh, one of those.
I think it was Robert.
Yeah.
Robert was the.
I'm too old to have Randy be my
Oh,
bishop.
that's true. He was Cleon's bishop. I know that.
Cleon was my Wyoming teacher. I loved Cleon. There was a green and gold ball. And I had a date with Howard, and we had been practicing to be in the grand showtime. But then they asked me to be one of the royalties or something. And so Howard and I didn't get to dance in the floor show. But I loved to dance. I tell Wally, you just have the bar and jig. But Wally played ball, so of course I knew Wally. And I guess he knew me. We were at a music festival, and we were I was in the triple trio, and I read the program, and they didn't have our triple trio on that list. So I stood up and I said, "You don't have our number here. We would like to sing." And so I suppose he learned early that I have a mouth. And I say things.
You stand up for yourself.
And we sang.
Well, that's what you were there for.
I guess so. And Marion Tibbs was the pianist. Brother Two taught us music, even though he was the seminary teacher. He taught seminary a couple of years. And then I had another seminary teacher, but I can see his face, but I don't remember his name. Loved seminary. We took a seminary trip down to Salt Lake, and Howard Holyoke got mumps on the way down. So we tried to stay away from him. I realized on that trip that the church is the same wherever you go. I realized that. And that was sort of a revelation to me. The church is the church wherever you go. Dad used to be invited to speak. He was quite a speaker. And we had gone to Cody on this evening, and I went with Dad. And there's a terrible snowstorm, and so the Taggarts, who Dad knew, invited us to stay at their home, and I remember spending the night up in the Taggart home. Yep. My dad and I were great friends. Mother was a great mother, but our personalities are so different. Shirley was more like Mother, more gentle, more quiet. I don't know, I'm just loud and noisy.
I don't think so.
Well, you think you've covered it?
Yep, I think so.
You done? Looks like sounds like you've had a great life.
I've been talking for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
That ought to be enough.
That's good.
Okay, well, if you're done, we'll close. Okay?
This is Mother's buffet. Right there.
Oh, pretty.
And my daughter Lorraine wants that.
Now, you said you were going to Washington. Are you going to Washington State or
Yes.
Washington, Utah?
Washington State.
Because you said Washington, Utah earlier, and I thought, oh, maybe
Well, Beth lives in Washington, Utah.
Utah. There is a Washington, Utah.
I knew that, and I
It's
thought,
right
well,
next to
maybe I
St. George.
misunderstood, and you're going to Washington, Utah, not Washington
Yeah,
State.
we're going to Tim has a portable toilet business. His two sons and his son-in-law, all work to manage that company where they have all those portable toilets to move around the orchards. So they're welders and hard workers and do a lot of welding and putting together and
Very good.
work hard.
Well, it'll be a nice respite.
Well, I've been there many times, so I kind of know the ward and I know the area.
Mm-hmm.
We have a house that we're leasing or renting, and he is sending us a contract. And when we get it, we'll put some money in there and send it along.
Very good.
It's heartbreaking to leave.
But when Rula left Byron, it was heartbreaking for her. But she said, more and more people that I love are gone. And that's probably the way you're feeling. A lot of the people you knew and loved here have gone away. Moved away or...
Harold and Vivian Hopkins were my dear friends. Patty and Grant Sanders were my dear friends.
Mm-hmm.
And Aunt Evelyn and Uncle Ernie and Grandpa and Grandma.
Mm-hmm.
And Myrna. And Dick died this spring.
Yeah.
And Rula.
Rula and Mike, yeah.
And Jerry Neville.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. But I've done a lot of things in the church. I taught seminary. I was the primary president. I was the Relief Society president. I was the Young Women president. And taught a lot of classes. If I had to do it over again, I would be a better teacher. Do it better.
Yeah.
I've learned that teaching should be to touch their hearts, not to fill their minds with stuff, but to touch their hearts.
Mm-hmm. That's the new Come Follow Me training, don't you think?
Love that Come Follow
I
Me.
do too.
I was trying to get on Come Follow Me insights that I love to listen to, and my computer wasn't cooperating. I could get the picture, I could get the video, but I couldn't get any sound. So I'll try it today, and if it didn't work, I'll call Caleb Sanders, and he'll come over and fix me.
Oh, good. Well, I know Marguerite wants to ask you about some houses.
Well, okay. We'll say goodbye
Okay.
for now. Okay.